I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. It's time to be counted and counted on. In a moment, Joseph Salvo, the Chief Demographer for the City Planning Commission. He explains the challenges of the upcoming census, why it will be especially difficult to get an accurate count, especially with some New Yorkers fearing deportation. My Times colleagues join me to discuss the week where news events overtake us at every turn, and I'll have some final thoughts with Coda. But first, Joseph Salvo, Chief Demographer, head of the Population Division of the Department of City Planning. Joe, you are worried in particular this year. We've got a census coming up in 2020. That's a lot sooner than most people think. What's at stake here?
Well, to begin with, political representation. New York State is likely to lose one congressional seat. We're not keeping up in terms of our population growth with the rest of the nation.
So we'd be down to 26 from a high of 45, I think.
Yeah, and there is a risk if there is a serious underenumeration, a serious shortfall in the census, that we could lose 2 seats. And then there's redistricting. When you draw a district, you're supposed to draw it based on who is actually there. In some cases, though, if you have a big underenumeration, if you're not counting everyone, then you're drawing a district that's really not accurate relative to the population that's there. And then finally, there are the services we provide. $600 billion gets distributed by the federal government each year. New York State gets a piece of that, okay? New York City gets a piece of what New York State gets. And that money funds all kinds of services for the city. For example, we can all relate to this: bridges and roads, okay? $1.6 billion to the state each year from the federal government. The population count affects that number. Section 8 housing vouchers, money for children in schools in poverty areas of the city, money for the disabled, a whole group of services that we provide to the population of this city is at risk if we have a serious problem with the count.
And the Times had a story the other day that the census or a lack of an accurate count can even affect your health because so many health statistics are based on the information gathered in the census and that base rate. Now, what worries you in particular this year? The Justice Department wants to include a question on are you a citizen or not? Will that drive people away?
Well, in general, response to surveys nationwide has gone down. Now we have the introduction of fear, especially among our immigrant population. New York City has 3.2 million immigrants.
Legal and illegal.
Yeah, yes. And 45% of the population, of the foreign-born population, are non-citizens. And as I like to say, those people who are having dinner with each other every night across the table don't distinguish between who is legal and who is not. They're having dinner together, they're part of a family. But those people who are undocumented, sitting across the table with those people who are, they're all concerned and they're all worried that by answering, you're putting those other people in jeopardy. You're putting your family in jeopardy. And that is a serious threat to the enumeration.
So, of course, the census is supposed to count everyone, citizens and not. What can New Yorkers do about this? Obviously, you're having an outreach campaign to explain to people why it's important. But is there anything ordinary people can do to make sure the count is accurate?
Well, the mayor the other day spoke at the State of the City about civic involvement. And that's what we need. We need people to become more involved in their communities, because as they do, they will see the real life effects of the numbers that come through in the census and the numbers that drive a lot of the programs and a lot of the things they rely on day to day. So becoming a better citizen, becoming a better active member of a community, a better, a more conscious person relative to the community you're living in is a benefit to everyone.
One of the better ways people can get involved, of course, is making sure they return the census form or get counted, and their neighbors as well. What trends do we expect to see in the 2020 census? The city has been growing. It's been growing a little more slowly than it had in the beginning of the decade. What number do you think we'll hit in 2020?
Well, we originally had a projection of about 8,550,000. And we are going to be revising that projection upward probably to about 8.6 million. The growth in this decade has been astounding in the city. New York City is responsible for most of the growth, virtually all the growth in New York State. And the growth in the city early in the decade was very high. It's kind of leveled off a bit now. But by any measure, when you grow by 400,000 people in a city of this size, which is really what we're talking about, it's just amazing and testimony to the attractiveness of the city to people from the rest of the country and the rest of the world.
And of course, even more so because this is, as it's called, sort of an older city, not one of the booming cities of the South or Southwest, and yet we are still growing.
Right.
How much of that comes from foreign immigration versus domestic, from births over deaths?
In 2000, it was about half and half. That is, people coming in from the rest of the world versus people coming in, that is from other countries versus people coming in from the 50 states. Now, it's about 2/3 of the in-migration to the city is from the rest of the country, especially young people coming here from all over the U.S.
And if you've explained to me many times, there is a churning of the population. People are coming, people are going.
Yeah, net migration, as we call it, which is the net result of people coming and going, is around zero in effect. But New York City has 65,000 more births than deaths every year. We add the city of New Rochelle to the population just based on the birth levels in the city.
Now, a lot of that comes from immigrant groups. It also comes from Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. But have the proportion of immigrants changed much? Are Dominicans now outnumbering Puerto Ricans, for instance, who of course are not immigrants?
But no, the largest groups in the city are immigrant groups are Chinese, and the second, of course, would be the Dominican Republic. But of late, Bangladesh has become an increasing force in the city's immigration. But what's happened is we continue to get large numbers from all parts of the world, Eastern Europe, for example. And as we watch this develop, we see the neighborhoods of the city change and the transitions that occur in ways that revitalize us. And that's been our secret all along. And we want to make sure we maintain that churn because that churn is healthy. People leave. I mean, they leave and they come in. I mean, that's part of the healthy churn that I'd like to talk about.
Is growth intrinsically good? Is it always good to get bigger?
Well, the way I would put it is that growth has its limits. It's okay. We are, with the exception of the Bronx, a series of islands, and there is a limit to our growth.
We can always go up.
Right, and we have in many ways. But there are limits to growth, but this pattern that we're in now, which looks like slow growth, and which is what we're projecting for the future, is healthy, not so much because it's growth per se, but because of the people that come in and leave, because of the churning, as you referred to it before. That's what makes us healthy, because we revitalize our population. We get a constant injection of people and all of their motivations for a better life.
And almost all the motivations for coming here, of course, are people who are striving to make life better for themselves or their children.
Right, and they're not necessarily wealthy coming in here. That's the whole point of it. When people come here, they're coming for a better life, and they may not have the highest levels of education, but we have the City University of New York. We have pathways to upward mobility in this city that have historically served us incredibly well, and it's made us the dynamic place that we are.
How does our civic engagement, responding to the census, voting, compare to other places around the country, similar places?
I wish I had those numbers on the top of my head.
Well, it's certainly in terms of participation in the census, for an urban area, how do we compare?
Okay. It's important to recognize that all these factors that could hurt us in the census, they are all over the country, that we do not have a monopoly on these problems. An inaccurate census hurts everyone. Thinking about rural America, there are places in rural America where housing is a problem. Getting that housing onto the Census Bureau's list is a problem. So you may have a jurisdiction of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. An undercount of a few hundred is serious for that place. Okay, there are immigrants in many states, red and blue. Think about Florida, think about Arizona, think about Texas. They are all affected by the effort to put a new question on citizenship on the census. And they all those people, all those immigrants feel threatened, not only in New York, but in other places.
Let me ask you a hardball question. You don't usually engage in politics, but when you have a deputy director in charge of the Census Bureau who is against population growth, it seems, in some respect, or not encouraging an accurate count, when you have a budget that's cut, when you have a question possibly on citizenship, does this collectively amount to sabotage by the administration?
What it amounts to is a compromising, it compromises response. That's the way I would put it. There is no issue there. Okay? These actions compromise the ability of the Census Bureau to run a good census. If they don't have a budget, they can't test the technology they want to use to make the census
And
better.
they can't follow up.
Correct. We had a problem in 2010 in Astoria, for example, where there was an underenumeration, where the Census Bureau was calling huge numbers of housing units vacant. It was not spotted till the year after the census. They have technology now, which, by the way, is being used by UPS and FedEx, that we can spot that as it happens. But will the Census Bureau have the budget to test that technology? Will they have the budget to deploy it? That's the problem right now. We don't know. Time is working against the Census Bureau as much as budget at this point. So we have a budget issue. We have an issue of an absence of leadership. You need a director and a deputy. And they have to be people who are knowledgeable about how the census works from the higher level view, so they can look at all the procedures. There are hundreds of operations that have to come together, and we need leadership to do that. And finally, putting a question at this late date onto the census is a logistical nightmare. The Census Bureau takes years to test questions. Did you know that changing wording of a question, adding a question, just simple changes to a form can affect response in a huge way?
Sure.
And the Census Bureau needs to test and test. There's no time for that.
We'll invite you back and remind people to respond and to help the outreach program of the Department of City Planning and the City of New York, something the mayor is involved in as well. Joseph Salvo of the Department of City Planning Population Division, thank you for joining us. And my Times colleagues join me in a moment to assess this week's stories. Welcome back. Another horrific school massacre. Mayor de Blasio laid out an ambitious agenda, as much a national one as a municipal one. Between the lip and the cup, lots of hurdles to achieving his goals. Dysfunctional seems to be the kindest word we can use to describe our national government. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my New York Times colleagues, contributing writer Eleanor Randolph, City Hall Bureau reporter William Newman, and Metro reporter and former crime scene columnist Michael Wilson. Michael, a sentencing this week to a terrorist, a man who tried to blow up a bomb in Chelsea, 2 life sentences. Does that actually discourage subsequent terrorists or would-be terrorists?
I suppose time will tell. The timing is interesting. It's only been in the last couple of months we've had 2 major attacks on the city. Right, we had the guy who drove his truck down the bike lane in Chelsea, and the attacker who tried to blow up a suicide vest in the walkway in the subway system. So there would have been anyway a lot of attention paid to the sentencing on Tuesday, and the judge went through. He's basically, technically, he's got 8 convictions in front of him and 8 possible sentences. And so, with all these variations and the guy's criminal history or whatnot, he determined it would be what he kept coming back to, his life plus 30 plus life, which practically speaking is impossible, but legally it matters. If maybe one of those life sentences is someday overturned on appeal, there's still the other one, etc. Will it deter? Who knows?
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah.
Willie, fairness. How does the mayor define fairness? He mentioned it 38 times in the text of his State of the City speech.
Well, that's probably the greatest thing about fairness for him, is that there's no real definition of it and there's no way to measure it. And so he can say that he's going to make New York City the fairest city of them all, but how will we ever know that we've gotten there? And it was also
Sounds like something from Snow White.
It does. Well, it does. That's what comes to your mind every time, mirror, mirror on the wall. But he gave his State of the City speech, and it was an odd speech. He wrote it, we were told. And it was packed at the beginning with everything he'd already done. He had a 12-point list of the things that would make us the fairest city of all, and there was mostly things that he'd already started, so there weren't any real new ideas there. And he has this sort of mayoral yoga that he's able to do, where he simultaneously pats himself on the back, thumps his chest, and blows his own horn. And there was
sort of like a contortionist.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then at the end of the speech, he became very dark, and he talked about how the country was, you know, in danger, our democracy was in danger, which is true. And his, you know, he said that he was going to save democracy in New York by taking several steps, including trying to register more people to vote, and in some inchoate way encouraging people to participate in elections and to run for office. So.
You know, wasn't there a poll, I think it was a Quinnipiac poll, that showed that most New Yorkers don't want any of they don't want the senators, they don't want Kirsten Gillibrand, they don't want Cuomo to run for national office, but the people who, de Blasio has the lowest percentage of people who want him to run for office. It was something like, it was in the teens, it was something like 17%, which was, you know, I mean, people, they want our state and city officials to actually concentrate on the state and the city.
And well, certainly mayors have got a lousy record of going on to higher office. I don't think any since the 19th century. But when the mayor wants to increase voting and participation, does he need a charter revision commission to do this? Can he do it by fiat or with the city council?
Well, he could certainly do it by legislation, but he's chosen to, for the first time, create a charter revision commission, which is something that he gets to do all by himself. And I think there must be something very satisfying for mayors, because Rudy did it maybe 4 times, and Bloomberg did it twice, and now de Blasio wants to do it. They can do it all on their own. They can name all the people who are on the commission. They can tell the commission what to do, and it must be a very sort of satisfying and autocratic.
They still have to get the voters to approve it, though.
Well, at the end of the day.
And what about the notion of someone who has spent a lot of money in his campaign, got a lot of contributions, claims a mandate when there was very little turnout? Is he the best one to advocate positions like this?
No, he's not. But let me say one other thing about the Charter Revision Commission is that Corey Johnson, the new city council speaker, said yesterday, well, we're all for a different sort of charter revision commission that has more input from different sectors, including the council and other elected officials, and takes a broader look at government. But he was very skeptical of using a commission to do what the legislature could do, to do what the council could do,
you know,
such as improving the public financing system for elections.
That's the way Rudy used it. He used that charter commission to make sure if the mayor uses it, then the council can't use it, can't come up with a charter.
You could only have one at a time.
You could only have one at a time, and the mayor can command that space. It is
speaking of the mayor and the council, I was really surprised that they reached an agreement on replacements for Rikers Island in each of the 4 boroughs. How come that happened as easily as it seemed to happen?
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. I know that that 3 of the sites were already jail sites, which made it easier. I know, for instance, that Steve Levin, who's a councilman in Brooklyn, whose district includes the House of Detention there, said, look, they reopened the House of Detention, and it didn't do anything to stop the gentrification of the area, or if you don't like the word gentrification, the area is prospering. And so he, from the beginning, said that he was open to doing something there, and it's the same at Manhattan with the old Tombs, and then the Queens house of detention or jail, whatever it's called, which is closed now, but is next to the courts in Kew Gardens. The new site is in the Bronx. Not Carlina Rivera. Anyway, the new councilwoman from that district, who is a protege of Melissa Mark Viverito, who was one of the biggest advocates for this, and she got behind a site in her district. So it came together very quickly. You'll note that there's no site in Staten Island. It's politically too difficult, although the mayor simply says it's not necessary. But yeah, that came together, and I think that you have to give some credit to Corey Johnson, who pushed for that to happen.
Interesting.
It's
Michael, you had a fascinating story the other day in the Times about opioid overdose. The numbers are astounding in New York City of people who are dying from this, higher than murders now. Tell us what was so special about this case.
Well, you hit it already. I mean, the bar is almost high to write about an individual victim because there are so many thousands. A few days before my story ran, we had a story on the front page out of New Hampshire, the guy who overdosed 4 times in a day and was revived repeatedly throughout the day. My individual, the plain sight of it all, and how everyone closest to him missed any sort of warning signs struck me. Here's a teacher, a high school teacher at a special ed high school in the Bronx, who was found dead of an overdose in the faculty bathroom.
Of the school?
Of the school. And school had just let out, and he's by all accounts a very responsible, respected teacher. He did extra stuff after school. He was involved in clubs and talent show. And he's got young kids at home and one on the way, and he commuted an hour each way to this job he loved. And it set the school back on its heels. And his wife was kind enough to let me in 2 weeks after into her home and tell me about him. And her candor made it a really good story.
It certainly was frightening. Eleanor, quickly, tell us, what did we learn from the state corruption trial this week?
Well, it's sort of more the
Don't go to jail in the middle of your trial if you're testifying.
Well, the judge has decided they've started to make too much of that, and they need to sort of move forward. And it is probably true that, but you know, a defense attorney, that's what a defense attorney does, is make sure that the government's prime witness is flawed, and you can see, and the jury can see every single flaw. And that's, my presumption is that they might end that part of it pretty soon. We'll start to see a little more testimony against Joe Percoco and the gang, and you know, the ZT gang and the people who call each other Fatso, and it's really...
It certainly exposes Albany at its worst, and of course one of the things, as we've said before, is it's amazing to see what is legal in Albany, much less illegal. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, William Newman, Michael Wilson for joining me, and some final thoughts coming up next. In 1846, Frederick Douglass enraged some temperance leaders in London. He declared that slavery was an even greater evil than alcoholism. Afterwards, a Brooklyn minister approached him, hand outstretched. Douglass recoiled. "Sir," Douglass replied resolutely, "were we to have met under similar circumstances in Brooklyn, you would never have ventured to take my hand, and you shall not do it here." A new book, Frederick Douglass in Brooklyn, makes the case that Brooklyn became a powerful forum for Douglass's abolitionist agenda after he escaped from slavery in the South. The book is edited by Theodore Ham of St. Joseph's College. It includes the texts of 8 speeches Douglass delivered on equality, slavery, and the Civil War, mostly at Plymouth Church, the Bridge Street AME Church, and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Properly speaking, there are in the world no men as self-made men, Douglass declared. That term implies an individual independence of the past and present, which can never exist. One sympathetic observer was struck by Douglass's, quote, peculiar wit, sarcasm, drollery, dramatic intensity, and more than all, his noble moral earnestness, set in strong relief by an indefinable and touching sadness. Reviewing Douglass's memoir, Margaret Fuller gushed in the New York Tribune, We wish that everyone may see what a mind might have been stifled in bondage, what a man may be subjected to the insults of spendthrift dandies or blows of mercenary brutes, in whom there is no whiteness except of the skin. But Brooklyn's most strident voice at the time was the Daily Eagle. It was a Democratic newspaper. Its editorials advanced the Southern sympathies of New York's financiers, manufacturers, and maritime moguls. At worst, the Eagle's editorials and letters demonized Douglas. At best, they dismissed him. Douglas, the paper said, was, quote, possessed of extraordinary shrewdness for one of his race. In 1858, Dred Scott died. The Eagle predicted that the namesake of the Supreme Court ruling declaring that slaves were property rather than people would endure, while Douglas's legacy would be forgotten. Frederick Douglass, the smartest darky we have produced, will leave no name beyond his generation, the Eagle predicted. But Dred Scott, a poor, simple-minded old Negro, will live in the annals of this great nation as connected with a great constitutional principle. Once the Civil War began, though, Douglas seemed more acceptable, at least by comparison. He discusses the slavery question in a far more rational manner than most of his white co-laborers of the cause, the newspaper said approvingly. By 1895, when Douglas died, the Eagle was beyond forgiving. While allowing as how it was too soon for the Negro to prove himself equal to the white man, the Eagle singled out Douglas as exceptional. It was not because he advanced the interests of the Negro that men will honor his memory today, the Eagle editorialized, but because by advancing the interest of the Negro, he raised the level of all mankind and made the whole world better by living in it. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.